The dark waters from the north. It came a time that Leonardo could no longer live inside the house of his adopted family. He grew up 1.5 times larger than an adult mole. Initially, it was a problem. Building a structure anywhere in the forest or along the banks of the lake was prohibited, and it was Leonardo who came up with the idea on where to live. A hole on the high flat mountainous limestone above the passageway from the lake to the sea was a perfect place for him. The hole was just a short distance up from the surface of the lake, and the site was acceptable to the elders. The males made him his room, bed and cabinet inside the cave, and they were all similar to what he had when he was still living with his adopted family. The door was made of black woods and was sealed, preventing light to pass through from the inside. During the night, the hole looked dark and seemed an uninhabited part of nature. Leonardo became useful to the males as he helped them whenever they hunted fish from the ocean by closing and opening the gates from Malservian to the sea. He also helped in the harvest of sea, collecting fallen logs, and picking up fruits and plants from the forest. He was a very strong kind who could lift a small log alone that normally was carried by 3 males. He could gather much wine barrels that were floating onto Malservian. He became like a mole in many ways, and most of them learned to like him. Majority of the males' belief of a Sumik changed in time from what they were told to what they were seeing from Leonardo. All the time, Leonardo did not know that he was a Sumik, for the elders had strict orders to all the males to keep silent about Leonardo's race. They followed it without fail, and Marcello told Leonardo that he was a wraith, a kind who lived far in the west as advised by the elders. Miro was observing him all the time and was keeping a close watch of him, of what he did, how he moved, and who his friends were. Each time Leonardo retired for the evening, he would stare at the lake and its surroundings from his new home. Up the wall, he could see the entire large lake, stretching far to the north, where some soils from the hills were visible due to thin trees. To his left, he could see the stretch of the forest and the hills beyond, and farther were thick trees rolled up on the high hills. He could barely see the tips of some mountains, and the tall and the prominent twin trees made him curious each time, for there were times that he could see lights on top of it and on its body. The woods in the far east that were emitting colors similar to a rainbow fascinated him always, and so were the blue falcons that mostly took flight at night, heading in different directions. They behaved like bats as they stayed in the trees most of the day, except for some occasional flights diving into the lake to catch small fishies during the day. Since living with the males, Leonardo had not seen any kinds who live outside the mole forests, except for the Waroms. Waroms were winged kinds who fed on jipan leaves that grew in the mole forest in the east. Waroms were very beautiful kinds with long shiny blonde hairs, fair smooth skin, blue eyes, and dressed in white thin silk clothes that revealed their slender and beautiful bodies. They emitted a very thin glow of light whenever their feet touched the ground and whenever they walked into the forest. They had very fragrant and soothing scent that remained and filled the woods each time they wandered the forest to harvest jipan. When the males and Malservians first came to Malservian, the Waroms were the first kind they met. It was one sunny day when Waroms appeared in numbers. The males and Malservians were surprised at their sudden presence, and they thought they were vile kinds. El Nirak, the Waroms' queen whose body was shining most, told why they came and what the eastern forest was to them for several centuries. This made the males and Malservians realize that they were the intruders and not the Waroms. Waroms were the only kind that they allowed to get near and communicate with them. Each time before Waroms swarmed the forest to harvest, they met the males and the elders. They brought them fruits as gifts, plenty to feed the males' village for weeks. Leonardo came close to a Warom named Lizzie. She was one of the fairest amongst them, with soft like cotton red lips and cheeks as rosy as a rose. Her voice was angelically soft as her fair body. A Warom's life was as fragile as they looked. Though they didn't age, they could die from a mere touch of a hand on their face, or if their face was scratched or cut. Amongst all the parts of their body, their face was the most protected by a strong transparent silk that could not be torn apart. Males forbade anyone to be with any kind other than their own without the permission of the elders. This was the same rule for the Waroms, and so Leonardo could only glance and smile at Lizzie each time she and he would harvest jipan together. Waroms also knew the rules and they followed it without fail. However, Leonardo found his way to the beautiful Lizzie and their relationship bloomed. After each harvest, Waroms bathed in Mathipus and played with young males on the waters, and just before sunset, they departed to the east and only returned after 500 days. Since knowing Lizzie, Leonardo counted the days, wishing each day was the 500th. Leonardo was all thoughts about Lizzie. He was about to close his eyes to sleep when a thunderous sound echoed in. He sat up and listened, but the sound continued, and this time it was becoming louder. It was coming from the outside. He rushed to the edge of his home, and when he opened the door and got a glimpse of its cause from afar, he was stunned. The falls from the high cliffs in the north were spilling large volumes of water at an unprecedented rate. He watched as the woods far north shook, bowed down, and some disappeared one by one. He saw the water raging downhill, carrying logs, fallen trees, mud, branches, and many other things, until the hills transformed into huge waterfalls, spilling large volumes of brown water and debris towards Mathipus. He realized that the lake water was rising fast, and its color changed from a mirror-like image to brown. The force of the flood created waves rushing southwards directly to where he lived. It hit the base of the limestone walls as he felt its impact. He could not move. He couldn't see any males along the banks as he continued to watch. Mathipus swallowed objects, rocks and debris. The entire village was submerged in water as he saw several creatures, lifeless, floating onto the lake. Some of them were Malservian, while some he only saw for the first time. He couldn't remember how long it took until the flood finally receded. The northern hills were almost bare with trees. The lake became still once more while the water slowly receded, exiting underneath the hole towards the sea. The village slowly rose, and he thought about his adopted family and friends. He quickly made a move to check down when he saw dark bodies rising one by one from Mathipus. The Malservian. It was not unusual for him to see Malservian rose out from the water in the night, but it was seeing them in their full battle gear and in such large scale that almost filled the entire lake. It was as if there was a war to be fought, as each carried a shield on their left arm and a sword, or an axe or a spear on the other. They lined up one by one as they got to dry land, till both sides of the lake were starting to be filled with dark bodies. The lake was also filled with Malservian swimming towards the north to the bare hills where little volume of water still flowed. He saw Ichab emerged and was quick in commanding the Malservian to light their torches. Malservian marched inside the forest on both sides. From where he was standing, it seemed the edges of the forests were burning from the fires of the torches of the Malservian. They were all moving in one direction, northwards. Uphill he could barely see flickering lights coming from the northwest and northeast of Mathipus. The guards of the fortresses were merging with the Malservian from the Lakib. He watched as Malservian continued to rise out from Mathipus, and there were already thousands of them, but they didn't seem to stop from rising out of the lake. He never knew that Malservian numbered in the thousands. He never knew that the Lakib could contain such size of population. "Leonardo, are you all right?" A voice called upon him. Below, he saw Marcello, Carlo, Siddiq, Cadio and several others on the lake bank. "Yes, I am fine." He ran descending from the limestone wall until he was with Marcello and Carlo. From there, he could still see Malservian coming out from the waters. "I saw a great flood. The water from the cliff was so much, and it was not even raining, and the sky was clear." "What happened?" "It is spring. Every 8,000th night it comes. It is powerful water from the north that destroys anything along its path." Marcello replied while Leonardo and Carlo were staring at the brown-colored lake filled with floating debris and creatures including dead crocodiles. They too did not survive the powerful water. Leonardo gazed at the Malservian that were the only life in the waters while they swam north. "Where will the Malservian go?" Father asked Carlo. "They will go to the edge of the rainforest in the north. They will give aid to those that were hit by the flood and support our guards." "Support from what?" Cadio asked. Marcello looked at them. For years, young males had no idea of their deep history with other kinds in the north. Leonardo and the young males of his age were not fully aware of what it was at the hands of other kinds in the past, for Malservian and the forest shielded the new generation from the atrocities, evilness and greed of the outside world. They only heard of them but never imagined what it was like running away from the hands of evil races. Marcello himself didn't know, for he was not yet born when his ancestors left Zereclada. Age, however, and the occasional story of old males about the past made him to picture what it was then. Usually, when spring comes, it also brings unwanted kinds. Those kinds who bring harm to us. The young males and Leonardo gave him an inquiring look. He remembered how his late father responded to him when he too gave the same look. There are kinds who seek for us, for what we are. To them we are like animals that they hunt and kill. They don't see us as a living being. Almost every northerner wanted us for reasons that we couldn't comprehend, including the Waroms who were friends of our ancestors and the Garadians who live not far from us here. This was the reason why we have to live on our own and be isolated from the world. We cannot risk to be seen by any kind and invite mercenaries in our new home. The Malservians are out there to search for enemies and make sure that they don't go back to where they came from for the safety of our race. Who are they? Asked Leonardo. They are the Bixers from Bixa, the Waroms from Nosnev, and the Sumiks from Igathansha. My late father told that long before, we inhabited a lake in a place called Zereclada. It was as beautiful as Malservian. Waroms came one day together with the fiercest kind, the Sumiks. They attacked, destroyed our village, burned our homes and brutally killed any male that they saw. The Sumiks were unforgiving. They beheaded the males and brought it like trophies in Igathansha, their land. Leonardo was silent and still. He could not imagine how such a kind could be so evil and barbaric. To the males that he saw nothing but kindness and compassion. Siddiq was reenacting what Marcello was all saying, and it was as if his head was the one cut as he made faces, bent his knees and fell head first on the mud while his body was shaking. This irritated Cadio. Siddiq, it is not funny. Siddiq raised himself with mud still on his smiling face. Leonardo and Carlo could not keep their laughter and Marcello was himself smiling. He continued. The males fled. Not all were lucky. Some were not able to make it. A few hundred unfortunate males went southwest, crossing the wide river to a place called Tuz, a very dark and swampy land where unfriendly trees and beasts live. Some kinds, many of them, came out from the swamps. They had spears, axes, and swords. Males tried to run back to the river, but it was too late. The unknown kinds were also there, rising out from the waters. They enclosed the males. Males didn't know how to fight, and fortunately, the unknown kinds my father and the others saw in Tuz were not enemies. They are them, the Malservians. Miro, their elder, listened as the males told him on their fate in the hands of the mercenaries. They stayed in Tuz for some time, thinking that in a few days, the mercenaries would leave. They intended to go back to their village, but they knew that it was no longer possible when they were told by a Malservian scout that the Sumiks were seen crossing the river to Tuz. Our elders asked Miro to flee. However, Miro just told our elders that his army can take the foreigners. Our elders begged that they be allowed to go, that Miro agreed. He told the males to move south and follow the flow of the great river. They followed Miro's advice until they discovered Malservian. Many males died along the way, especially the wounded ones, due to hunger, attacks from forest's beasts, and exhaustion as they went from rivers to different forests. A few weeks after, just as the males were settling, they were disturbed when the grounds shook. They were all frightened, for those were the same sounds they heard before the attack at Zereclada. There was no more a place to go but to the lake. Our elders asked each male to dive and hide inside the water, to stay no matter how long it takes. Atan, the brother of your grandfather Siddiq, saw a cave underneath where they hid and waited until the intruders were gone. However, the wounded attracted large beasts from the sea as sharks came out in numbers, passing through the open passage from the sea towards the lake. A few oblivious males were unfortunate and many of the wounded fell prey. They were not able to swim as fast as the others. They scattered around the lake, avoiding the swarms of sharks that saw them like seals, until large numbers of familiar kinds swam towards them. All were armed with crossbows, and they were the Malservians who just came and aided the males by killing the sharks that were attacking them. Wow, they saved us twice, Siddiq remarked. Yes, we owed them a great deal. Miro told our elders that they would also stay in Mathipus as they left their homes at Tuz, for they told that the mercenaries attacked them too. Since Malservius and males coexisted in Mathipus, and it was agreed that we live in the banks of the lake and they underneath the Lakib. We made our village to blend with nature, to be invisible to the eyes of other kinds from the outside, for Miro told the males that it is better that way than replicate our homes at Zereklada that the other kinds could easily recognize. We helped Malservius build their homes under Mathipus, and as time passed, observing our immediate surroundings for anything, we were all convinced that Mathipus is a safe place for us. Except for the sharks. Yes, Siddiq, but only for a moment. After what had happened, we built gates in the passages to ensure no beast could go into the lake, and it was Aten who gave the idea, designed it, and worked on it with a few others to ensure that we are safe from the beasts of the sea. Of course, he is my grandfather's brother. That's what makes me confused whenever I hear about your olds and I see you, said Cadio. Leonardo and Carlo were shaking their heads and smiling, seeing the usual Cadio and Siddiq went together with them. Yes, your grandfather's brother was great, but was not that so lucky in another way? He did not survive long enough to see you and your father grow. He became ill due to sadness and just disappeared one day. The males failed to find him and were hoping that he was with the Waroms. However, Elnirak failed the males' hope. She told they also didn't know where he is until the males gave up and considered Aten as lost. Marcello stared at Siddiq, who changed face that reflected sadness this time. He knew about his great-grandfather who was in love with a Warom named Tira. When a small group of Garadians was lost in their eastern forest, they saw the Waroms, who they thought were just like beautiful white birds. To the eyes of other kinds, with the exception of animals, males, Malservius, and a few others, Waroms were just birds feeding on the grounds of the forest. A Garadian aimed his arrow and hit Tira. Aten came to her and quickly removed the arrow embedded on her back. She was bleeding bad but still managed to smile at Aten as she removed the silk cover of her face. She asked Aten to kiss her and bid goodbye, while Aten cried like a child, seeing his fair one's eyes staring at him with tears of goodbye. He yielded to Tira's request as she expired. Her body vanished as Aten laid her back on the ground. The other Waroms flew away in haste, but the Garadians saw Aten, who they thought got their catch. At first they thought he was a wild beast until one seemed to recognize him as a mole. They chased him, but he was too quick for them as he used the trees to flee. He managed to get to the woods near Mathipus and warned the Malservius on the presence of the foreigners in their forest. The Malservius were quick and captured the foreigners, who were all shocked, seeing for the first time a large group of ugly faces in arms. They had never seen a Malservia before. Miro asked them one by one, and he found that the group was all but bandits, thieves who stole from their village, hunted by their own kinds, and got lost in their forest. They didn't know what to do with them until Jinko advised that they be sent back instead to their village. Miro did not agree, telling the males that doing so could endanger them, for they may speak about them. Though the Garadians did not see Aten clearly, they however believed that what they were chasing was a mole. The Garadians have sought them and joined the hunt for the same reasons as the others for decades. They never found a mole until they saw Aten. However, they never got close to know the truth, for they were already at the hands of the Malservius. Miro yielded to Jinko's request, and the Malservius set the Garadians free. They blindfolded and escorted them out of the forest up to Garadia and crossed the river at the cover of darkness using the boats of the bandits. They released the Garadians in their own land. A few days later, the river of Garadia was filled with many sailboats. The thieves told about their find, and it attracted hundreds of Garadians, including the king's warriors, to explore the far land at the other side of the river. Together, they sailed the great water until they reached the shores. They were all armed, learning from the thieves that there are a few unknown and armed kinds who live in the forest. As they were lowering their sails and unloading their supply, they heard trouncing sounds from the woods. Not far from them, the light running downhill was slowly covered by bodies of several Malservians as they marched out from the hills where spears and shields were darkly visible. They stopped uphill as if watching the enemy reacted to their presence. The Garadians saw the path uphill blocked by them. They were not many, they thought, and the thieves were right. The Garadians formed their own line, thinking that they could take the enemy uphill, and they were led by the king's warriors who were underestimating the resistance before them. They readied for an attack, but before they could advance, they heard swooshing sounds when the leaves of the trees at the back of the resistance were disturbed violently. A few arrows flew in the air towards them and landed not far from where they were. It was a warning. The Garadians laughed at the few arrows that fell before them and instead insulted the resistance. Kibbo, the warriors' leader, ordered their own archers to shoot, and as they did, they saw in one motion that the dark bodies uphill ran back and disappeared. The Garadians were in high spirits, thinking that the Malservians retreated as Kibbo ordered the advance. They started to walk near the woods, but before they could touch its edges, the familiar swooshing sounds were heard once again. This time, the arrows were several times more than the warning, and it carried fire that could even reach their boats on the river. The blue sky was filled with dark sticks, and each one was emitting a glow of orange, red and yellow at the end. The Garadians watched in horror as several arrows landed on their boats. Their shields offered less protection against the fatal attack of the dark bodies. A few Garadians burned in fires as they rolled onto the soils, while some ran back to the river to stop the fire that was engulfing their boats. Then, the next wave of arrows flew in the sky, and this time it was much merciless as it filled the river bank with more screams as the Garadians scattered for cover. Their boats were immediately engulfed in fire. Inside the woods, the Malservians uphill reappeared, and so were the others who were just hiding at the edges of the woods at an almost striking distance with the Garadians. The hills were filled with thousands of dark bodies in armor. The Malservians watched the Garadians' changed faces from initial cheer to fear when they began to pound their shields, creating thunderous sounds. Their sheer numbers and the noise they created broke the spirits of the hundreds of remaining Garadians as they advanced towards them. A few Garadians fell in line and retreated back to the river to their boats and tried to take out the fire. To their astonishment, Malservians protruded out from the waters. The Garadians trembled at the sight of the thick resistance enclosing them. Miro all along planned the ambush, predicting that the Garadians would be back. It happened as he thought, and ordered Ichab to finish the foreigners. The thieves who brought their warriors and hunters watched in horror as the dark bodies mercilessly killed every Garadian on their path. The sight at the riverbanks was unpleasant, where the scattered remains of the slaughtered Garadians filled the shores. Only a few of them were made to survive. Some of them were the thieves who told their king that the Malservians were but a few and who lived days away from the banks of the river. The Malservians hanged the bodies of the dead Garadians at the riverbank to warn the others of the same fate if they would set their feet again at the shores, while sending a few survivors back home to ensure that their king would know the fate of those he sent to conquer the land in the other side of their river. Miro sent a clear message that if they would try to set foot at their land once again, they would bring the war the Garadians started in their own land. The stories of 1,000 merciless warriors lurking at the other side of the great river and the slaughter of hundreds of Garadians filled Garadia. This sent chills even to the olds who on their youth had been wandering freely at the other side of the river that were once peaceful but now filled with unknown and powerful kinds. The king poured all his hate to the thieves who led the Garadians to their death by making them believe that the Mals lived there, and they blamed the thieves on their fate. He was scared at the thought that the Malservians would invade Garadia and ordered the execution of the thieves. He sent their bodies to the Malservians to show that they were sorry and such thing would not happen again. The king's act was in response to the threat of the Malservians and from the stories of the thieves, for he knew that they couldn't stand a chance against them given that they did not have such a large force to repel the unknown enemy. He offered truce, and the Malservians responded affirmation by telling the Garadians to get their dead bodies and make the river bank as it was. The king immediately sent a few hundred unarmed Garadians at the other side of the river, and the sight of the dead bodies hanging Burned and decomposing plus the burned boats made them all shiver, changing the minds of a few to turn back and return quickly to Garadia. The king was expecting this as he sent his warriors to attack any Garadians who would turn back. He wanted his order carried out for fear that the Malservius would attack Garadia if they did not respond to their condition. The poor Garadians were left with no choice but to continue sailing towards the unknown land. Though scared at the sight of nothing, the Garadians quickly collected the bodies and cleaned up the river banks. They were filled with paranoia, thinking that any moment the Malservius would appear from nowhere and kill them all like the others. They worked in haste, loaded the bodies to the boats as fast as they could, while the others pushed the burnt boats into the river to sink or be carried by the current southwards. When the work was done, they all departed in haste. They never saw any Malservius anywhere. They didn't want to see, and even while sailing back to Garadia, their thoughts were filled with dark bodies rising out from the waters to their boats, but none ever happened. Miro's plan succeeded, and since no Garadian had ever set their sails westward nor farther away from their land while they were on the river in the west. Since the battle with the Garadians, Miro proposed to build a fortress in the east and in the west to be guarded by the Malservius. It served as their initial line of defense against the possible intrusion of any enemy from the east and the west. The elders agreed on this, and the males built their fortresses during the cover of the night, but while during the day they slept on top of the trees while the Malservius guarded the river. As soon as the sun set, they continued their work until they raised the fortress. It took 17 long years to finish the east fortress, and except for the children and the mothers, every male had their hands on its walls. That included Marcello, who was then young. That's where your mother and I got closer, Carlo. It was a sacrifice for all of us. Many of us got lost in the rainforest on our way back. Some fell victims to forest beasts and siege. When the east fortress was built, we then went to the west and did the same thing. Unlike the eastern side, the western side was not that hostile. It was quiet up there and beautiful. The great Dikon mountain stands tall, and the sunset is quite and equally magnificent. What about the north side, father? Do we also have a fortress on top of the high cliffs? No, Carlo. The north was left open since spring passes there each season. Besides, it would be very difficult for any kind to come from the north. Strong water runs on top of that high cliffs. The huge and powerful river from the north flows through it, and that is the reason why the cliffs have waterfalls. However, it was less powerful because the hills and the rocks up north divert much of the flow of water from the north to the west, except when spring comes. The great eastern river separates us from Garadia, Symphus, and the Grenk forests. They are all outside our fortress in the east. Also, we do not want to attract any attention from the north by building anything there. The fortresses worked so far, for we have been living peacefully since. Marcello stared at the marching Malservius. Leonardo and the males looked in the same direction. We hunt and fish for the Malservius, and in return they protect us. Against our faith as males, we have to build an army, for we do not want the unfortunate event that happened to our ancestors to happen to us again. Malservius are the compromise to our faith, and the good thing is no Mal would like to be a Malservia, and for many decades now, we live in peaceful coexistence. They are marching up north to kill any Bixes, Vamoths or Sumiks that were swept by spring. We cannot risk to be found by any of them here in Mathipus, for there is no more place where we could live in peace. Usually, we find a few Bixes and some other kinds, but most of the time they are already dead. Though against our faith, we do not want to take risks, so we make sure that every enemy that was taken here by spring does not live. Leonardo then stared at the floating bodies in the waters. Are some of them Bixes, Vamoths or Sumiks? Marcello glanced at the lifeless bodies of other kinds still floating onto Mathipus. I see no Sumiks, but only Bixes and Vamoths. Those two bodies with bald heads and dark skins are Bixes. The one being fished out by a Malservia right there is a Vamoth. The others are beasts from other forests. A Vamoth child, Leonardo uttered as he saw the Malservia dropping a small childlike body of a Vamoth along the side of the lake. No, Leonardo, that Vamoth is not a child. It is a grown-up and as strong as any one of us. Mammoths may be small creatures with very young face and body like a 7-year-old mole. But, don't let it fool you. Mammoths are skilled warriors better than the bikes. They are much talented and could create lethal weapons out from anything. Usually poisons. They are very good users of poisonous darts that could kill you instantly. Malservius don't take them very lightly. He continued to stare at the different kinds that were being fished out to the side of the lake by the males and Malservius. I wonder what a sumic looks like. Marcello looked at Leonardo and smiled. I was told that sumics look like a wild boar and as large as a bear. Since we live in Mathipus, we never found a sumic yet. Only bixes, mammoths and a few other unfortunate life like those crocodiles and other beasts and animals.